Hey guys, what is going on? I've been reading from my book, I Once Was a Pilgrim, and we still find ourselves right now in India. I just visited the Taj Mahal, and we're gonna move on from there. After Agra, the Amber Fort was explored, as was the Monkey Temple and the ancient city of Jaipur. In 1876, the entire city was painted pink at the behest of Sawi Ram Singh I in order to welcome the Prince of Wales. There, everything was indeed pink, even the palace. Leaning against its walls, I watched as a metalsmith made copper pans. He sat on his haunches and spun a disc on a lathe, transforming a block into an oval sheet before coating it with tin that looked more like ash than metal. After he transferred it to his anvil, turning the pan in his hands and making small dents on the surface with a hammer. When he seemed to be satisfied with his work, he cast the pan aside only to begin work on another. His movements were so deft and deliberate that I forgot that the world went on beyond us until young men, still teenagers, approached and asked where I was from. When they learned that I was from America, they smiled and chanted, "Obama, Obama, Obama." And in the fading afternoon light, I was reminded of a hope that is no more. And then the question that now inevitably follows, Trump? It was a question that I still did not know the answer to. If I were to be honest, I had left America for this reason among many. For weeks after the election, I did not speak to my father, unable to comprehend how he voted as he did, incredulous that the most intelligent man that I've ever known was in support of his opposite. Of course, I could have stayed in America and joined arms in protest, but there is more than one way to resist. There is more than one way to resist. Remember that. Besides, it was important for me to leave my country, for I am a child of history, and I know that the President of America is no different than the past of other nations, and I was curious to know how the world sees itself through even the most difficult times. That night, after the setting sun left this pink city aflame and coral, I climbed into the back of a rickshaw to see what becomes of Jaipur in the darkness. The driver was a Hindu man who, despite the heat, wore long sleeves and long pants and sandals that barely covered the bottoms of his feet. For an hour, maybe two, we toured the streets of his city. On the way back to the hostel, he turned down a road in which we seemed to be the only vehicle traveling in the opposite direction of all others. I laughed as I leaned in to ask, "Sir, are we driving the wrong way down a one-way street?" And maybe, long used to these wild and reckless roads that make even Thunder Road look tame, he took his eyes off the road, or maybe he kept them forward. But whichever way he faced, he said the words that were to define the rest of my journey. "This is India, madame. Nothing is impossible." And he was right. This was indeed India, and nothing, not one thing, was impossible. After leaving him to the night, I climbed to the roof of the hostel where there's a restaurant open to the sky above. On this moonless night, a man softly plucked the strings of his guitar. When he began to sing, I knew not whether he sang of love or loss, nor did it matter. For dinner, I sat near his stage, alone but never lonely. Somehow, while traveling, these words lose their meanings. Alone means nothing. Lonely, even less. Before me was a dash of chole, a chickpea curry as hot as the night, and as beautiful too. This meal, like all others, was a solitary celebration, a reflection upon all that has been and an anticipation of all that will be. With each bite came the realization that this was only the beginning of my journey. It was only the beginning. Long after the last sip of spice left my lips, the night fell silent and sleep came, filling this pink city with pink dreams. From Rajasthan, I flew to Varanasi, landing in a city immersed in chaos and calm. Here, the dust never settled, but rose in the air as dry and dense as the heat. On that late April morning, the temperature stood suspended over 100 degrees, the heat and humidity clinging to one another, neither willing to surrender its grasp. Once in the rickshaw, I did as the drivers do, and wrapped a scarf around my head, loose enough to see, but tight enough to offer what protection it can. We weaved from one side of the road to the other. If there were any lines, they were lost in the dust. Varanasi is one of the most ancient and holy cities for Hindus. It is the home of Lord Shiva, creator, protector, and transformer of the universe. It is also the place that the Ganges River courses through on its way east from the western Himalayas to where it empties into the Bay of Bengal. While born of myths and legends, the river plays a vital role in the daily lives of the residents of Varanasi, for like Shiva, its waters are the source of birth, life, and even death. Dropped among the throngs of humanity that heaved and pulsated on every corner, I did not know where I was. There were no street signs. Even if there were, would it matter? I could not speak Hindi, let alone read it. Eventually, I found where it was I was meant to stay, and stubborn or foolish that I am, The heat knows better than to differentiate between the two. I walked to the Ganges. The city of Varanasi is a maze of streets so narrow that even with so small a stature I was able to reach from one side to the other, touching the bricks that have offered shelter and shade for thousands of years. To get to the river was to walk through these precarious passageways before emerging onto one of the many ghats of the city where the landscape opened to the river and the sky. Under the unforgiving sun, water swept past, carrying with it all that is holy and unholy in its flood. A cow waded into the river as children swam and splashed one another in the rushing tides. Along the embankment, women washed their laundry, scrubbing the dirt from their sheets and shirts before rinsing it in the waters. That day grew hot, too hot to breathe, and I returned to my hostel to hide from the sun. Soon the world would grow dark, and I would return to the river in time for Arti. The ritual performed every evening in Varanasi, giving thanks to the goddess Ganges, sorry, I can't read right now. At sundown, crowds gathered on the ghat to watch the ceremony. They sat on the steps or in small boats that floated close to the shore as children jumped in and out of the darkened waters. Along the river, lamps and lanterns were lit, and the chants of pandits rose above the dancing light. The heat rose too, unabated by the darkness. For more than an hour, cymbals were rung and small offerings were made to the river. In silence and awe, I inched closer to the edge of my seat, as did the woman next to me, who had as many years before her as there were behind. A crimson shawl wrapped around across her shoulders, matching the bindi in the middle of her wrinkled forehead. Every now and again we smiled at one another, but never exchanged a word. As the ceremony unfolded, sadhus, holy men, came and went from the crowds. Wooden prayer beads strung from their necks, and their dreadlocked hair was wrapped in tight buns on top of their heads. With faces painted orange and white, their expression did not stray far from the muted bemusement of the pageantry before them. They begged from all who passed rupees in exchange for the pleasure of their pictures. Pilgrims and paupers, all of us, always searching for holiness in whatever shape it takes. Long after the ceremony ended, I fell asleep dreaming of Shiva, dreaming of Ma. When it was still dark, not yet morning, and noise awakened me from sleep, I rose from my bed to glance out the window. Below, a parade of pious men shambled through the narrow alley, chanting as they walked toward the river. Some held drums, marching to their beat as they shuffled through the streets. Curious, I dressed and followed them to the Ganga to witness what becomes of light when it travels. Tinged pink, the river reflected wisps. Sorry, I'm like really having trouble reading. Wisps of apricot from the clouds above. On the edge of a ghat, a man, shirtless and barefoot, sat cross-legged and played his flute, charming the sun from its slumber. Soon it rose like a snake from the east, ending the night and beginning the dawn. Still early, I returned to the hostel for a small breakfast of fruit and tea. The hostel was run by a young American woman who used to work with Kate at the American Embassy School. Some years before, she left her post because she felt that it sheltered her from the rest of India. She saw no sense in coming to a country and not live in it, truly live in it. And so, moving from Delhi to Varanasi, she founded a school for children who sometimes lived in houses but more often lived on the streets of the sacred city. For years, she has worked with men and women from Varanasi, providing food, shelter, and medicine for these children and their families. Wanting to know more of life in India beyond being a tourist, I went with one of these men to visit children and their families who live on the Ganges. When both the sun and the heat were at their highest, I rode on the back of his motorcycle without a helmet through the alleys and unpaved roads of Varanasi. Again, I wrapped my scarf around my face to protect myself, not from the wind, but from the dirt that rose from the ground and lingered in the air, coating everything in soot and black dust. With the dexterity of someone who knew not the meaning of an open road, we dodged in and out of the already crowded and confined spaces of labyrinthine alleys, so narrow that they seemed impossible to pass, and yet somehow we made it through. Before long, we arrived at a place where the Ganges is barely trickle, the waterway impeded by plastics and pollution. On the shore of the river, we walked past homes that were no more than makeshift tents of cardboard, tarpaulin, and sometimes sheet metal, or simply the bridge that spanned overhead. Families gathered in tight circles outside of these homes. They smiled as he passed. He has been here before. At first, I remained silent, uncertain what to say or how to act when confronted by so much humanity. But the silence lasted only until I felt a gentle tug on my hand and then another. Before long, I was surrounded by children covered in sand and little else. Then I became a tree, not because I was rooted and could not move, but because the children began to climb the branches of my arms and legs, coming to rest on my shoulders, and for the smallest among them, the top of my head. Their ages were no different than that of my nieces and nephews. How could it be they lived worlds apart? But knowing that the joy of children is often no different in one part of the world than another, I threw them each in the air as they shrieked with laughter and begged for more. How light they were, how heavy this was. And while this might have been poverty unabashed, this too was life unrestricted, and this, more than any river, more than any mosque, more than any meal, was why I was a pilgrim. To be reminded over and over again that to accept the world for anything less than what it is to strip it from its meaning and its magic. We stayed for the whole afternoon, leaving only when the light changed from a bright blue to a muted gray. I'm going to keep on going. I just want to make these videos short so maybe you guys actually listen and stuff. I'll see you in a couple of seconds.